Hello and welcome to the Empower Couples podcast, where here you get modern, non-boring relationship advice for you and your partner to communicate like pros, fight smarter, and stay on the same team no matter the challenge that you face. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman.
And I'm Jocelyn Freeman, but you all just know us as the Freemans.
And this episode is about breaking destructive patterns mid-conflict to prevent arguments from escalating further.
So there are actually 3 stages of conflict. If you've read our book, The Argument Hangover, you know that we break it down this way. But there are actually tools and strategies for each of the 3 stages. There's before conflict happens, there's during conflict, and then there's the after conflict stage, right, where repair is supposed to happen. And really, it's important that you as a couple are acquiring skills for all 3 stages. And today we're going to be focusing on the mid-conflict stage, right? So emotion is already escalating. What do you do to prevent it from getting more escalated further and damage being done? I do want to say that we are hosting one more free web class in 2021 on this topic. We're going to go so much deeper. It's going to be a 90-minute web class, and it's October 5th. So you guys, it's coming up really soon. A bunch of you have already saved your seats if you follow us on Instagram, and it's onlinecouplesworkshops.com. This will be the last one in 2021 before baby Freeman joins the family. So make sure you go to onlinecouplesworkshops.com, save your seats, because we're going to go into this, fighting smarter, how to prevent them beforehand, how to handle emotional triggers better, and then how to repair. The repair process is so important after a disagreement. But like I said, we're going to be focusing on the during conflict stage. Now, Aaron, what do we hear a lot from couples that they try to do around conflict? The word starts with an A.
Avoid?
Yes, avoid them. But why, Aaron, is it important that couples unlearn this belief that it should be about avoiding conflict?
Well, if you avoid conflict in the short term, it just builds into resentment in the long term. Mm-hmm. Now, a part of life is that you're going to see things differently. You're going to see events, you're going to see scenarios differently than your partner, and at times you're going to have different maybe emotions about that. This is not a problem. The problem is that when you try to force that yours is right over your partner, then emotion starts to escalate. And while we're covering this today, it's the patterns, it's the things you end up saying and doing when that emotion gets high that does more damage to your partner.
Exactly.
Does more damage to the relationship. And in turn, when you do this, it also lengthens your argument hangover period. So rather than avoid, you should really seek to do these 2 things. Keep things from escalating, and that comes from the destructive patterns. That's why we're covering this today. The second piece is shortening those argument hangover periods, and that's much more about using the 5 R's and repairing a after conflict strategy. Mm-hmm. So that's the main thing. You're going to have things in life that you see differently. This is fine. You actually want those in your life, but can we first start with breaking destructive patterns so you don't end up doing more damage and getting into a more deeper conflict with your partner than is necessary?
Exactly. Well, and the key thing for this process, you have to be willing to acknowledge and confront that you do have patterns. We all do as human beings. And whether it came from what you saw your parents doing, or maybe it was your original kind of formative romantic relationships where you built up these patterns, you have to own that during conflict, there are certain things I say and certain things that I do, and I have to own that. But that's why we call it a pattern, because it's not who you are. You aren't someone who is stuck a certain way. Like if you more raise your voice, you tend to bring up the past, you tend to say hurtful things. You're not stuck that way. That's a pattern. Just like, and we asked this question yesterday at the couples workshop, how many of you are the people who shut down in conflict? And a lot of people,
those people don't raise their hand though.
Right. They're more quiet for sure. But a lot of people resonated with that. And that can be just as damaging. But before we get into those specific things, just really, you've got to, during this episode and after, as you reflect on it, acknowledge what your patterns are. I had to do it. I had to face the not so beautiful part of myself, because some of you OG listeners have heard me talk about, I used to be very outwardly expressive in unhealthy ways. And I had to own that. I had to look at that not so beautiful part of myself.
And actually, if we were to take this even deeper, which we're not going to right now, all of life is a pattern. You actually are a pattern. What you call your personality is actually not much more than your strongly identify with belief about yourself, which is actually just a pattern. So I think that's interesting just to think of it that way, because pattern is something, as you said, when you can acknowledge it, you can change it. And that's the main thing. You can see, oh, is this pattern serving me? Is this serving the relationship? And if not, you get the opportunity to say, let me take a look at this. Let me see if I can do something differently. And this is about anything. Like, you actually have a pattern of like going to your job. You have a pattern of how you interact and how you perceive family members and friends. You notice that if there's a certain group of people, right, that you have a tendency or a pattern of being a certain way around. I think a lot of people can identify this with a certain family, right?
Yes.
It's like you show up and then your, call it an attitude. Your inner way of being is a pattern. You walk in that door and it's like you already know what they're going to ask you. You already know that they're not going to ask you anything at all. They're not going to ask you about how things are going in your life. And we can so easily fall into a pattern or way of being, a pattern of being, which then drives a pattern of speech, a pattern of action. And if you start to see your entire life as a pattern, wow, you could really start to make some significant changes, which brings us to the mid-conflict here. I just want to put that forward because it's not as difficult as you might think. And it is just a pattern, and all patterns in life can be transformed.
They can be completely changed. Patterns can be changed. So what's happening mid-conflict? Well, in this mid-conflict stage, for one, usually for both of you at this point, there is now more emotion present. One or both of you is triggered, right? Emotionally triggered. That's a big topic we go into in the Argument Hangover, and we will be covering on the web class too. So when you are in this heightened emotional state, what's actually happening, and for some of you this might be a new term, but it's actually an amygdala hijack. So your amygdala, a certain part of your brain, and Aaron's even more into the science, so he could explain this better, but we actually aren't connected to our logical state of mind. It's much more primal. It's much more where our instincts are kicking in. And that's why even if one of you is trying to come in with logic and explain the situation, it's not helping. Because when emotion is present, when you're triggered, when your amygdala is hijacked, you are in a state of emotion. That's not the time for logic. Logic comes later. So what you want to work on together as a couple is how can you not avoid these emotions? There might be times that you're angry, you're sad, you're frustrated, all those things. However, to build the mastery of not letting those emotions drive your actions. Like you can be mad and still choose to take a more constructive action. But we've got to understand your brain, and you've got to be more aware in those moments and identify when you're triggered. And this is going to be something we really challenge all of you to do, is to identify when you are triggered. We're going to get into those steps, but I want to talk about what we typically hear with there's fight, flight, freeze, and now there's a newer one I've been seeing about fawn, right? Because we've all heard fight, flight, freeze, and then fawn. Fawn is like people pleasing. You kind of just want to please your partner. You want to make amends. The biggest ones we see with couples in this mid-conflict emotional stage is fight or flight, right? Like there's the person that is more outward, yelling, name calling, bringing up the past, storming, or like kind of slamming things. And then there's the flight person, the one that gets quiet, shuts down, gives one-word answers. Which one are you? Are you fight, flight, freeze, or fawn? We're not going to go into the fawn one because that's just not the biggest one that we see during conflict. Anything you want to add to this, Aaron?
Well, as you said, mostly we see the fight or the flight, which, like in our book, we would call reactive and repressive. So those are really the two main categories to look at when we talk about needing to break mid-conflict patterns. And is it an automatic? Well, both these are automatic, right? You can often think that the outward gestures are more damaging,
Right.
as you mentioned before. But both of these patterns are unconscious. These are both the patterns that automatically run, and they can be very outward, as you just mentioned. So that's the reactive, but then there also can be the repressive. And the repressive, maybe in the short term, doesn't seem as damaging, but in some cases it is. And, many couples that we talk to, it's funny because the more reactive assertive, if you will, type of partner, it's funny because you would think that because of their outward actions, they sort of control or dominate. But how many times have we seen that the loud, the outward, the assertive, reactive partner actually feels very controlled in conflict by the one that shuts down?
Exactly.
Because when you think about it, if I just leave the conversation, who's most in control of this conversation happening or not?
You.
Yeah. Usually the other one is semi-willing to stay in it, even though they're in a reactive pattern. But if I just walk out, there's no conversation happening.
Right.
So that just leads to the damage in the sense of not like name calling, but in a sense just feeling totally isolated, totally disregarded, not paid attention to. And sometimes you get to a worse place of like the indifference or being numb, right? Sometimes that can feel even worse than if a partner's standing there and they're reacting to you. There's a certain sense of, well, they're engaged here. Well, sometimes it's like, maybe they don't even care anymore.
Yeah, and at this point, if you're listening to this episode with your partner, we'd encourage you to just pause for like 5 seconds, maybe a little bit more than that, and each identify what your patterns are. Because like we said, for you to be able to change anything, you first have to confront what your default patterns are. If you're listening to it solo, then just pause and maybe write down what your pattern is. But it's important that you aren't labeling yourself and you're not labeling your partner. And I hear people label their partner. They are this way. No, if you're going to give your partner a fighting chance, no pun intended about fighting, but if you're going to give them a chance to evolve, to change, to transform, you can't see them as stuck the way you think they are.
Yeah, it's not who they are. It's a pattern.
And you and I, when we have conversations and we debrief from conflict, we don't say like, you are this way. We ask each other to look at the pattern. Hey, I just want to point out to you this pattern I'm noticing. And it feels, it's still, challenging to notice and confront, but it doesn't feel as much like you're attacking their character or telling them that they are a certain way. So that's just one thing I want to say. So you got to identify what's the pattern.
Well, that might be a huge takeaway for you listening. Actually, that came up a couple of times in the couples workshop. Both of the exercises that the main ones we take couples through, the expectations and the listening one at the end. It's funny because we always give a little script, right, of how to say things. And it's either from the I perspective or the we, but what almost always tends to happen. It's like, yeah, I feel. So they try to use it. I feel like, okay, great. They're using the I perspective. That I'm like, oh no.
Yes.
It's just such a pattern. It's such a tendency to, I feel this way. And it's clear because if you weren't doing this, I wouldn't be feeling this way. And over time, your own pattern makes that pattern who they are, not just a pattern of theirs.
Right.
So notice how these patterns can get very sneaky and tricky because it does end up seeming like reality. And that's the hardest part about this is you make a belief. You make a belief about your partner and then you label them as such or you blame them for the way you feel when, like you said, if honestly you could just get and start to use your communication such that, hey, a pattern that I'm noticing, even by saying that you have or that I have.
Or we have.
Yeah. When we have a conflict, mid-conflict, what I was noticing is we both tend to have certain patterns. What I see for myself is I kind of shut down and I know I start thinking to myself about, well, in this case, what you're saying is right, what you're saying is wrong, what I agree with, what I don't agree with, and I'm actually not really listening to what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that a pattern I have.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's huge. And that actually almost leads us into the next step here. So we're going to go into a few steps to break these destructive patterns. Now, the web class is going to be going much further into these because we have more time with you, and visuals. Visuals are so helpful. You can hear us right now, but if you haven't attended one of our web classes, the slides are helpful. The visuals really help you soak all this in. So again, make sure you go to onlinecouplesworkshops.com to save your seats. But we're going to start to at least cover how you can break these patterns. So first, and we already kind of touched on this, but it's important that you do it, write down or discuss together what your patterns are and take ownership of them. You've got to take ownership of them. So it would be something like you thinking to yourself or saying to yourself, no one can make me do these things. My behavior is in my hands. And I think you kind of touched on this, Aaron, but it's easy to say, well, I did that because you. Mm-hmm. I only raised my voice because you weren't listening. I only left the room because you weren't understanding me. No, you choose your actions. And that's the first place of having power to change, is taking ownership of your patterns.
I'm going to throw one in here that's not in here, actually.
Okay.
When I mention patterns, and I mentioned that your personality itself is a pattern, well, what that actually is a pattern of thought. So what's easy to think, it's not even that easy, but what we're mainly talking about is pattern of action. And I just realized what you might actually write down here is, what is your pattern of thought in that moment? What is your pattern of thought about your partner, or how these things go mid-conflict? Because it's actually your pattern of thought, which, because you replay it so much, is actually what you would say a belief about how you guys fight or about your partner. But it's the patterns of thought that actually lead you to your patterns of action. Mm-hmm. So if you want to actually change the patterns of action, you have to really get clear for yourself on what's the pattern of thought here that's driving that.
Yeah.
So just thought to say that here, while you're writing down the pattern of action, it's a little bit easier to access than, well, if that's the way I act, my pattern of action, then what must my pattern of thought be that is the source of that action?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I love that addition. Surprise addition. Okay, another step to break these destructive patterns is to recognize the moment you are triggered. Now, easier said than done, but truly one of the best things I have acquired for myself as a skill is being able to identify that I'm triggered in the moment and not just after the fact. So this means slowing down. If you're in a conflict with your partner, you can feel things escalating more. I want you to slow down, be in your body, realize, oh, okay, I'm starting to feel this pressure in my head. I am feeling hotter. I feel like I'm about to take those actions I normally take. Oh, I'm triggered right now. You've got to be able to identify that you're triggered in the moment. It can't always be upon reflection after the fact. And this is huge. And if you can call out to your partner and say, hey, I realize from what I'm feeling and what I'm, feeling a tendency to do, that I'm triggered right now. And this leads us to the next step then. The moment you feel as though things are not going down a constructive path, you've got to have the mastery to call a timeout. Now, yesterday at the workshop, it was interesting because one of the guys raised his hand and he said, well, isn't it good that I'm not saying the mean thing, that I'm just walking out of the room? And I said, your intent is good in terms of you're trying to not do damage to them, but there's a difference. And we break this down in our book, The Argument Hangover, the difference between walking out and a timeout. And it's really important that you are saying, hey, I don't want to do damage here. I want us to have a constructive conversation. I know that because I'm triggered right now, I might go do my normal patterns, and I'm not committed to that. So I need 20 minutes to go on a walk, to cool down, but then let's come back to it in 20 minutes. And that's what a timeout sounds like, as opposed to, forget it, you can't talk to me this way, I'm leaving the room. which can leave your partner feeling isolated, abandoned. They don't know when you're going to come back to return to the conversation, and it can feel damaging. It feels like someone just, abandoned you. So the timeout is critical. And you can't just say, well, I'm triggered and so I have an excuse for my behavior. No. You can be triggered and you can still choose to consciously request a timeout.
The other powerful thing about being able to have the awareness to request this timeout actually leads to the next point. Because the main thing about patterns is that it's happening, back to back within a few milliseconds, and you don't realize in that moment, you're not choosing that action. So what you have to do to change the pattern is create a gap. You have to create a gap between the emotion that's now in your body and the action that is normally produced by that emotion. And so that request for the timeout creates that opportunity, right, for, what's the last one here?
Yeah, so what you want to do is have something that interrupts the pattern. So it could be saying, hey, we're about to do our normal things. Why don't we take turns being a speaker and listener? Right? Like the pattern interrupt, do it differently. So you could say, hey, I realize we're going down the normal path. I'm going to stop talking. You share. I'm just going to listen and I won't interrupt you. So being able to have those can be really helpful. It could be, hey, you know what? We aren't having a great conversation right now. Let's go on a walk. Let's change our environment. Someone even suggested yesterday, they were like, go to a restaurant because you won't yell at each other in a restaurant, right? So it's like, maybe go grab a bite. Say, hey, you know what? We need to pause this because right now we're not being constructive at home. Let's go grab a bite to eat, because if we're in an environment where there's other people around, we're going to be kinder. We're not going to be outwardly taking it out on each other. So that pattern interrupt. Anything you want to add to the pattern interrupt?
No, that's the whole goal of this podcast, and we're not even here to tell you what exactly it is. You just have to notice what's the pattern, and actually summarizing, as I said before, it's all a pattern of thought, and that pattern of thought or belief generates emotion when the same outside events happen. That is a pattern of then action, and largely in mid-conflict, these actions are either doing more damage or eventually are prolonging your argument hangovers. Mm-hmm. So the main thing of this entire conversation is that you have to stop that pattern, but then you have to insert something else. Mm-hmm. You can't just lay on the ground and go to sleep. I guess you could go to sleep. Probably won't, because you have a lot of emotion. There's actually, a teacher you listen to that says, if it ain't going your way today, just go to sleep.
Take a nap.
Just not end it.
Right.
But maybe that's the end of the day for you, right? And so when you wake up, the tendency is that you've actually put down that pattern of thought. Mm-hmm. Now, many people wake up and in a few seconds they pick it back up, but you had that opportunity to insert something different. And that's the whole point of this conversation. What would you do different? What could you do different that would at least keep you both engaged? It would keep the conversation constructive. It would allow for just something different. It actually doesn't even matter at this point what it is. We want you just to practice interrupting the pattern and just putting anything different in there.
And when you do it consistently enough, it will become the new way that you two operate. And you'll wake up, months, because this can't be just something you try for a week. This has to be something you are committing to, breaking these patterns for months. That's how new habits and patterns are built, is from consistency. But then you'll wake up and you'll be like, whoa, look at us. We handle conflict so different now. Isn't that fantastic? So again, this is just a taste and appetizer. We're going to go so much deeper into conflict and before conflict, preventing them, during, how to really handle your partner's triggers and your own triggers better. And then after, everyone is really wondering about the repair process. How do we repair? Because just saying I'm sorry is not enough. So truly make sure you sign up for the last free web class of 2021 at onlinecouplesworkshops.com. That link will also be in the show notes, and it's in our Instagram bio. We can't wait to see you all. It's October 5th, so it's coming up here soon. And truly, the web classes are one of our favorite ways to connect with you all. But keep showing up for your relationship, keep committing to the growth, to the transformation, and we will talk to you all on the next episode.